On warm evenings when the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, people in the city knew where to find Jeremiah Cole. He stood on the corner of Jefferson Square, a worn leather notebook in one hand, his voice rising above the rumble of passing cars. Jeremiah wasn't a loud man by nature, but when he read his poetry, it felt as though the world bent to listen. His words flowed like music, verses about struggle, hope, and the history carved into every crack of the pavement beneath their feet. His poems spoke of fathers who worked themselves to the bone, mothers who prayed through hardship, and children who deserved futures brighter than the streets they walked. At first, only a handful of people stopped. Curious onlookers, teens with headphones dangling from their necks, tired workers waiting for the bus. But word spread quickly. "There's a poet down by Jefferson Square. You've got to hear him." Crowds began to form. Families lingered after dinner. Students came with notebooks, and even strangers who had planned only to pass through found themselves rooted to the spot, hanging on every syllable. When Jeremiah spoke, his voice carried something more than words. It carried the weight of truth. One evening, after he finished reciting a poem about rising above injustice, an older woman in the crowd wiped her tears and whispered, "Son, you said what I've been feeling for 40 years. Jeremiah bowed his head, humbled. For him, poetry wasn't performance. It was testimony. His father had once told him, "A man's voice is the one thing no one can take from him. Use it well." And Jeremiah did, night after night, with nothing but a notebook and his conviction. He turned a quiet street corner into a pulpit of hope. Yet, not everyone heard hope in his words. Some heard defiance. Some saw the growing crowds not as community, but as disruption. And one woman, in particular, would soon decide his voice had grown far too loud. Her name was Karen Whitfield. Karen Whitfield had lived in the city her whole life, but she never thought of Jefferson Square as a place for poetry. To her, it was supposed to be orderly, a landmark surrounded by clean storefronts, quiet benches, and neatly trimmed hedges. So when she first saw the crowd gathered around Jeremiah Cole, she frowned. She stood at the edge, clutching her designer handbag, lips pursed, as Jeremiah's voice rang out, "We rise not because we are told to, but because the ground beneath us is cracked with history, and we cannot live forever in silence." The people clapped, some even cheered, and Karen's face reddened with irritation. To her, it wasn't art, it was disruption. That evening, she wrote her first complaint. In a sharply worded email to the city council, she described Jeremiah's readings as a disturbance to public peace, bordering on dangerous provocation. She claimed the crowds blocked sidewalks, made the area uncomfortable for families, and that his words, though she never quoted them, were designed to stir unrest. When the city didn't respond quickly enough, she escalated. She called the police station directly. "You need to do something," she demanded. "This man is turning Jefferson Square into a circus. Poetry, ha! It's nothing more than agitation. If you don't shut him down, who knows what might happen next?" Soon, Karen began showing up in person. She stood near the back of Jeremiah's gatherings, arms crossed, glaring at the people around her. When he finished a reading, she would scoff loudly, "Shameful!" teaching rebellion instead of respect. Sometimes, she even confronted listeners. "You're encouraging this nonsense? Don't you see how dangerous it is?" But the crowds only grew. Teachers brought their students. A group of veterans came one night, saying Jeremiah's verses reminded them of why they fought. Even a few local business owners admitted his performances brought more people into the square, and more business to their shops. Karen seethed. Every time she saw applause ripple through the crowd, it felt like a personal insult. Finally, she decided complaints weren't enough. If the city wouldn't silence Jeremiah, she would take matters further. She would push for legal action, to strip him of the right to speak in public at all. Because in Karen's eyes, Jeremiah wasn't a poet. He was a problem to be erased. The first fine arrived folded neatly in a white envelope, slipped under Jeremiah's shop door. Violation of City Noise Ordinance. $250. He read it twice, his brow furrowed. He didn't use amplifiers. His only microphone was his own voice. But the citation was clear. Someone had complained, and the city was listening. That someone, of course, was Karen Whitfield. The next week, a police cruiser pulled up to Jefferson Square just as Jeremiah began reading a new poem. The crowd hushed, tension cutting through the air. One officer stepped forward, holding up a clipboard. "Sir, you don't have a performance permit," he said flatly. Jeremiah frowned. "I'm not performing. I'm speaking. This is public space." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Complaints have been filed. If you continue, you'll face another fine, possibly more." The crowd erupted in protest. "He's not hurting anyone," a teacher shouted. "We came here to listen," said a student. Still, the officers remained, watching until Jeremiah reluctantly closed his notebook. The disappointed faces of his listeners weighed heavier on him than the ticket itself. It didn't stop there. Each week brought new hurdles, citations for blocking pedestrian pathways, even when the crowd was small and orderly, warnings that his gatherings were unsanctioned events, letters from the city clerk's office hinting at legal consequences if he persisted. The message was clear: stop speaking or pay the price. Yet the people refused to let his voice vanish. On nights when Jeremiah stayed home, too weighed down by fines to appear, others gathered anyway. Students stood on the steps of the fountain, reading his verses aloud from photocopied pages. A local pastor organized poetry vigils, where whole families recited Jeremiah's work in unison. It was no longer just Jeremiah's voice echoing through Jefferson Square. It was a chorus. Karen, however, was unsatisfied. To her, this rebellion proved her point. The poet was inciting unrest. She pressed harder, filing for an injunction that would force the courts to decide whether Jeremiah had the right to continue at all. And just like that, a poet with a notebook found himself standing at the threshold of a courtroom battle, where his very voice was on trial. The courthouse steps were crowded the morning Jeremiah's case was set to begin. Reporters with notepads, students with handmade signs, teachers, veterans, and families all pressed close, waiting to see if the city would silence the man who had become their poet. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Karen Whitfield sat near the front row, her pearl necklace gleaming, lips curled in satisfaction. This, to her, was the culmination of weeks of effort. She had written dozens of complaints, lobbied city officials, and finally convinced the court to hear her argument that Jeremiah's public poetry was a disruption to civic peace and a threat to public order. When the bailiff called the session to order, Karen's lawyer rose. He spoke with practiced confidence, gesturing toward Jeremiah with disdain. "Your Honor, my client represents the concerned citizens of this town. Mr. Cole's so-called poetry gatherings have caused disruption, crowding, noise, and tension. His words, while cloaked in art, are inflammatory. They stir emotions that can, and will, lead to unrest. We are asking the court to restrict him from performing in public spaces, for the good of the community." Karen nodded emphatically, glancing at the press row to make sure her outrage was captured in print. When Jeremiah's turn came, he stood slowly, holding his notebook. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked around the room, the judge, the jury, the spectators packed into every bench. Many of them were his listeners. Their faces, filled with both hope and fear, gave him strength. His lawyer spoke first, laying out a simple defense. Jeremiah had broken no laws. His gatherings were peaceful, his listeners orderly. At the heart of this case, the lawyer said firmly, is not noise, not disruption. It is a question of freedom. Does a man have the right to speak his truth in the public square? Witnesses were called. A teacher testified, "His poems help my students see themselves with pride." That isn't a threat. It's a gift. A veteran spoke. "When he read about sacrifice, it reminded me why I fought. I've never heard words carry so much weight." Even a small business owner admitted his shop thrived on poetry nights. Each testimony painted Jeremiah not as a disruptor, but as a healer of sorts. Karen, however, remained unmoved. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, demanding harsher words, sharper accusations. But as the hearing continued, she noticed something she didn't expect. The judge was leaning forward, listening intently, not to her side, but to Jeremiah's. The case was no longer just about ordinances and permits. It was about something deeper. The question had become, could poetry, truth spoken aloud, be silenced by law? And soon, Jeremiah himself would have the chance to answer that question in the only way he knew how. The second day of the hearing brought even more people into the courtroom. Extra chairs had to be brought in, and still, many stood along the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation, like everyone knew that something important, something bigger than the case itself, was about to unfold. Karen's lawyer wasted no time. He rose briskly, striding toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, "we must be clear. The words of Mr. Cole are not harmless. They inflame emotions. They stir divisions. They are not poetry, but veiled rhetoric intended to provoke. Left unchecked, this will escalate." Karen herself leaned forward dramatically. "He is dangerous," she added, her voice sharp and carrying across the hushed courtroom. "He's turning people against each other." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the spectators, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Jeremiah's lawyer stood calmly. "We do not deny that Mr. Cole's words stir emotion," he said evenly. "That is the very essence of art. The question is not whether his poems move people. They do, but whether they incite harm. And there is not a single shred of evidence presented here to suggest that. His gatherings have been peaceful. His listeners, respectful. If anything, he has brought people together who might otherwise never share the same space." Then the witnesses began. A teacher took the stand. "My students recite Mr. Cole's poetry in class. His words inspire them to write their own. They are not angry, they are hopeful." A pastor spoke. "I've stood in Jefferson Square and heard him. His poems don't call for division, but for healing, for dignity, for love." A veteran rose next. He talks about sacrifice, about honor, about, "When he speaks, I see the flag I fought for. I hear the voices of my brothers who didn't come home. If that is dangerous, then maybe we've forgotten what freedom means." Each testimony chipped away at Karen's case, until her lawyer's arguments began to feel thin, almost desperate. Karen tried one last tactic. She asked to speak directly. Rising to her feet, she faced the judge and declared, "Your Honor, this man is clever. He hides behind flowery words, but the danger is clear. People don't cheer for poetry. They cheer for rebellion. If you don't silence him now, you'll regret it when this town is divided beyond repair." The courtroom erupted in boos and shouts of protest. The judge banged the gavel for order. But Jeremiah stood silently, notebook in hand, watching it all. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited, knowing his moment was coming. And when it did, he wouldn't need a lawyer to defend him. He would defend himself the only way he knew how, through his words. The courtroom was heavy with tension when the judge finally leaned forward. He had listened to Karen's accusations, the testimonies of teachers, veterans, pastors, and neighbors. He had heard lawyers argue about laws, permits, and ordinances. Now, he wanted to hear the man at the center of it all. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, his voice steady but curious, "you've been accused of using your words to disrupt the peace. I think it is only fair that we hear those words for ourselves. You may address the court." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face flushed red, her mouth dropping open in disbelief. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," she protested. But the judge silenced her with a raised hand. If his words are the heart of this matter, then his words must be heard. Jeremiah rose slowly, notebook in hand. He walked to the center of the courtroom, his steps steady, his eyes scanning the faces before him. The wary, the hopeful, the skeptical, the curious, He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was soft at first, then grew stronger with every line. He did not argue law. He did not defend himself with facts or figures. Instead, he read, I was born with a voice, and they told me it was too loud. Born with skin, and they told me it was too proud. But a man is not dangerous because he speaks of pain. He is dangerous when he is silenced, when his truth is chained. I do not come to divide, I come to remind that justice is not a whisper, it is the voice of humankind. The words hung in the air like thunder after a storm. For a moment, the room was silent. Absolute silence. The kind of silence where even the sound of breath feels too loud. Then, one by one, people began to rise. First a teacher, then a student, then a veteran, then nearly the entire gallery. They stood, not cheering, not clapping, but in reverent respect, as though they had witnessed something sacred. Even the judge, after a long pause, rose slowly to his feet. His eyes were damp, his gavel resting forgotten on the bench. Karen sat frozen, trembling with rage and disbelief. She had wanted Jeremiah's voice silenced. Instead, it had filled the room so completely that silence itself seemed impossible. Jeremiah closed his notebook and bowed his head. He had not shouted, he had not argued, and yet his words had done what no defense ever could. They had shown the undeniable power of truth. And now the court had to decide. Could such a voice be outlawed? The answer, Jeremiah suspected, was already written on the faces around him. The following morning, the courthouse was more crowded than ever. People filled every bench, stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, and even spilled out into the hallway. Word had spread overnight about what Jeremiah had done, how a single poem had held an entire courtroom in silence, then lifted them all to their feet. Karen arrived early, her pearl necklace shining but her face tight with anger. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, but even she seemed to sense the tide had shifted. Jeremiah sat quietly at his table, notebook resting before him, his hands calm. He didn't look at Karen, nor at the press. He simply waited. The judge entered, his expression solemn. He took his seat, shuffled his notes, and then looked directly at Jeremiah. "This case has weighed heavily on me," he began. "We were asked to determine whether Mr. Cole's public poetry represents a disruption, or whether it is protected speech." He paused, letting the silence settle. "What I witnessed yesterday was not a threat to order. It was not an act of division. It was art. It was truth. It was the very essence of free expression." He leaned forward, voice firm. "The court rules in favor of Mr. Jeremiah Cole. His right to speak, to perform, and to share his poetry in public is protected. The injunction is denied. Case dismissed." The gavel struck. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly still. Then it erupted. Cheers, applause, even tears. People hugged each other. Students raised their notebooks in triumph. Veterans saluted. The sound poured out the doors, spilling into the streets where hundreds more waited, chanting Jeremiah's name. Jeremiah himself stood slowly. His chest rose, as if he were taking the first deep breath in weeks. He nodded to the judge with quiet respect, then turned toward the gallery. When he saw the crowd, neighbors, teachers, children, strangers, his voice caught in his throat. For once, he had no poem ready. And yet, in their faces, he realized he didn't need one. Karen, meanwhile, remained seated. Her clipboard hung limp in her hands, her face pale. She had tried to silence him, and instead, her efforts had amplified him more than he ever could have imagined. That evening, Jeremiah returned to Jefferson Square. The same corner, the same worn notebook in hand. But this time, the crowd was larger than ever. Hundreds gathered under the glow of street lamps, their voices hushed in anticipation. Jeremiah smiled faintly and opened his notebook. "Shall we begin?" And as his words once again filled the night air, there was no threat of silence, no fear of interruption. Only the sound of a people who had chosen to listen. The man they tried to silence had become the voice of a city, and his legacy was only just beginning.